Well, here we are once again, and it's that time. It's time for the Sunday reflection. I hope you've had a good week. I hope that if you've had lots of snow where you are, you've been able to enjoy that and it hasn't made life too difficult. But it's certainly been quite a week for snow here in the North Yorkshire Dales. And you know by now how excited I get. So I have enjoyed being able to look at it and indeed go out for a walk in it. But I know, speaking to several of you, that you'd like it all to go away now. But it's what it is, isn't it? We're having quite a winter, it seems. And it wasn't just us here in the North Yorkshire Dales either that had the snow. Even my dad sent me a text way down in Cornwall and said, "It's all your fault, it's snowing here." So there we are. It seemed to have reached right from one end of the country to the other. So it's probably not escaped your attention that Sunday the 14th of February is Valentine's Day, a day when our thoughts naturally turn to relationships and love. Usually, of course, the focus is on romantic love, but perhaps it is an opportunity to celebrate all types of love found through life-enhancing relationships. Our set gospel passages over the last few weeks have highlighted the developing relationship between Jesus and his disciples. And we can deduce that a deep love and trust is blossoming. The disciples slowly more confident as their experience of Jesus and their devotion towards him deepens. Next week marks the beginning of Lent. Lent is usually a time within the Christian calendar when we take time out to reflect upon our faith journey and maybe look deep within our souls, asking any number of questions. But ultimately, there is one important question. Who do we say Jesus is? This was the question that those first disciples needed an answer to. It was certainly the question that the religious leaders were asking. It was even a question that Jesus' own family wrangled with. And it was a question that Jesus asked. I certainly believe that a life-enhancing relationship largely depends on the person with whom we share that relationship. So who do we say Jesus is? Jesus asks the question, who do you say I am? To open this debate, I am firstly going to read verses 27 to 33 from Mark chapter 8. So if you're there and you have your Bible, why not turn now to Mark chapter 8. So the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament, right near the beginning of the New Testament. We have Matthew and then we have Mark. So Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 27. Did I say that? Yes, I did. That's good. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then Jesus asked, "Who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to tell them that he, the Son of Man, would suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the leaders, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, and 3 days later he would rise again. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and told him he shouldn't say things like that. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, then said to Peter very sternly, "Get away from me, Satan. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. Get away from me, Satan." What I wonder would have been our response if Jesus looked you in the eye and said, "Who do you say I am?" What would you say? Peter often speaks for us, poses the questions we would want to ask, blurts out those statements that would be on the tip of our tongues. The scriptures indicate to us that the disciples themselves, Jesus' closest friends, his inner circle, they often argued amongst themselves. They often had different opinions. So poor Peter, he gets it so right, and then he gets it so wrong. I don't know about you, but every time I read this passage or I hear it read to me, I can feel Peter's pain. I can feel his confusion, his injured pride. So 6 days after speaking harshly to Peter in such a way, Jesus takes him and 2 other disciples, James and John, on a journey with him up the mountain. So we now turn to the set gospel passage for Sunday the 14th of February. Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 9. And this passage is famously known as the Transfiguration, a very strange and long word that simply means a complete change in form or appearance. So, let's now jump over in our Bibles to the next page, to Mark chapter 9, beginning at verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John to the top of a mountain. No one else was there. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance changed, and his clothing became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly process could ever make it. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. "Teacher, this is wonderful," Peter exclaimed. "We will make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't really know what to say, for they were all terribly afraid. Then a cloud came over them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Suddenly they looked around, and Moses and Elijah were gone, and only Jesus was with them. As they descended the mountainside, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until he, the Son of Man, had risen from the dead. Why, I wonder, did these 3 men get such special treatment? Perhaps it was these 3 that had the most influence amongst the group of disciples. These 3 certainly emerge regularly as an inner group amongst the 12. but I don't think so much as favourites, but as representatives of the others. Whatever the reason, it is only Peter, James and John that Jesus takes to the top of the mountain. It was clearly not easy for them to put their experience into words, but it was important enough to be recorded, and recorded not just here in the Gospel of Mark, but also recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And each of those accounts slightly different from each other, emphasising the difficulty they had in describing these events that we now know as the Transfiguration. Now, I don't know how many of you have climbed high mountains, but those of us who have will know that you spend an awful lot of time looking down at where we are placing our feet, and not a lot of time actually looking up. And when we are being led up, as is the case here, for it does say that Jesus led them or took them up. So when you're being led by someone, our view of the person in front is usually of their heels. It is not until we arrive at the top that we stop, raise our heads and take in the scenery, which is often truly breathtaking, awe-inspiring and worth every aching muscle and gasp of lung. Now imagine, if you can, with me, imagine the jaw-dropping, unbelievable, overwhelming, dazzling sight of the transfigured Jesus. Can we even begin to imagine it? We are used to modern, powerful spotlights and floodlights, aren't we? The brightest artificial light that we can imagine. But the brightest light that the disciples knew was a feeble candle or the flickering wick of an oil lamp. Sunlight for them would have been the brightest light they knew. And yet, it is obviously paling into insignificance when they try to describe the sensation of the overwhelming brightness when they looked up at Jesus. Words fail them to describe this experience. Can we imagine, I wonder, the brightness, the whiteness, beyond anything that we could describe? And we can almost hear Jesus thinking the question, "Now, who do you say I am?" Standing there in front of the transfigured Jesus, absolutely bewildered and overwhelmed, and seeing perhaps that unsaid statement, "Now, who do you say I am?" This was a deeply spiritual moment, a glimpse of the glory of God, a mere glimpse of the glory of God. In this indescribable moment, words fail them. And if that wasn't enough, suddenly two Old Testament figures appear. Elijah and Moses. They appear and then they have a conversation with Jesus. Why? That should be our question. Why? In my opinion, why should have been the question of the disciples too. Why were Elijah and Moses there? Well, I believe the key to the answer is what they both represent. Moses represents the law. The Old Testament law is represented by Moses. And Elijah represents the prophets, the Old Testament prophets. So we have the law and the prophets together. And together, the law and the prophets make up the Old Covenant. Now, if we put Jesus into this mix, who we now understand to be the new covenant, the fulfilling of both the law and the prophets. So if we put Jesus together with Elijah and Moses, these three men represent, I believe, God's dealings with humankind. The Old Covenant and the New Covenant, the totality of God's dealings with humankind. So maybe that's why they were there. The disciples do not speak, except, of course, for Peter. We are told they are too terrified to speak. Quite right, too. Wouldn't you have been terrified? I certainly would have been terrified. Maybe wanting to turn away. Maybe falling to the ground. In shock. I'm not surprised they were terrified, and I wouldn't have been surprised if they had perhaps even wet themselves with fear. But then maybe they did. It's not going to say so, is it? That's not a piece of information that you want passed on and recorded for future generations, that you were so terrified at this moment that you wet yourself. But terrified they would have been. However, it is Peter that opens his mouth, and his words, to be honest, they don't help, do they? But this is Peter, and it wouldn't have occurred to him to say nothing at all. He just wants the moment to last. He just wants to hold on to this glimpse of the glory of God. And haven't we all had those moments when we wish they could go on forever? Those moments in life that seem so precious and so special, and we would just like them to last. But we also know that life isn't like that. And so amongst all of this, as if their brains are not fried enough by what is happening, God speaks. He speaks from the cloud, confirming who Jesus is, answering that question, and leaving us in no doubt as to the answer to the very question that was posed 6 days earlier. The question that Peter answered and then got rebuked for. God says, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." What on earth must have been going through their minds as they climbed back down the mountain? They must have been bursting with the desire to tell the others. Bursting to tell someone what had happened. But Jesus orders them to tell no one. They were certainly full of questions. Wouldn't you have been full of questions? I would have been. You know me by now. I would have been full of questions. What has just happened was truly extraordinary. Literally extraordinary. The origin of the word extraordinary being Latin and meaning outside the normal course of events. This was extraordinary. But not only was the experience outside the normal, they are beginning to realise that Jesus is outside the normal. His natural state is way, way outside the normal. And for a brief moment, they were able to see him in all his glory. But it was brief. And now they are expected to get on with the job of being a disciple. And they do. They do get on with the job of being a disciple, but somehow it seems a little easier because now they see more clearly. It is the same for us. There are times when we lift our head just enough to glimpse God, and then for the briefest of moments, everything comes clear. And we know why it is that we press on and in whose name. Other days, we are not always so sure, perhaps. Who do you say I am? That's always the big question. Maybe it is not such a bad question to begin Lent with. Maybe not such a bad one. Who do you say I am? So thank you for joining with me once again in this reflection. And I do hope and pray that you continue to stay safe, and that as you begin Lent, this will be a time of getting to know God deeper and more closely. So take care. See you again soon. Got to find the mouse now to turn it off. Bye bye.